This playlist will collect together and organize the individual component modules, which together will comprise our lecture entitled The Revolution of Scientific Revolutions and the Rise of Logical Empiricism. The storyboard for this lecture has 3 acts. We'll begin by a recapitulation/reformulation of the lessons we've learned so far in contemplating oppositional substance dualism and monistic physicalism. Then we'll turn our attention to a historical period beginning roughly at 1877 and ending in roughly 1927. This period of 50 years I termed the Revolution of Scientific Revolutions in the lecture. This period of time dramatically shapes the individuals who come to intellectual adulthood during this time, precisely because of the pace and significance of the developments in science and mathematics during this time. Finally, we'll close with our 3rd act, where we discuss the rise of logical empiricism and how it's both inspired by and attempting to rationally reconstruct, or perhaps in a less favorable interpretation, to rationalize through reconstruction, this period of scientific development. Let's raise the curtain then on Act Number 1 and consider the road so far. Up to this point, we've been discussing the emergence of the concept of the soul and its ultimate refinement into the contemporary notion of the mind that we take for granted today. As we trace this evolution throughout history, we begin to narrow more and more. Using this lens of ontological frameworks, we ultimately settled upon 2 ontological frameworks as the main competitors for the potential means of articulating and theorizing about the nature of the mind: oppositional substance dualism and monistic physicalism. I suggested that in the period of time from Descartes up until the beginnings of the 20th century, this marks a period of time where philosophy transitions into what you might call normal philosophy. Oppositional substance dualists and monistic physicalists now engage in a regular program of research in which they try to refute the opposing viewpoint or further buttress their own viewpoint through arguments, both a priori and a posteriori arguments. These arguments try to establish the potential of their ontological framework and thereby its rightful place as the framework that should be guiding thinking about the nature of the mind moving forward. We said that as a result of this normal philosophy, we start to see relatively well-defined problems emerge for each of these ontological frameworks. And what we'll witness now is that oppositional substance dualism really falls away. Not because of a dramatic victory on the part of monistic physicalism in a set of a priori arguments per se, but more because of the fact that physicalistic explanations of all sorts of phenomena, including some aspects of psychological phenomena through physiology, mental chronometry, and so on, really does start to get traction and take a hold, whereas oppositional substance dualism simply finds no traction. It makes no progress whatsoever. So let's look at the 2 central problems associated with oppositional substance dualism. On the one hand, oppositional substance dualists have the problem of formulating theories providing explanation, predictions, and manipulations of the continual seamless interaction between the mental and the physical. Philosophers often call this problem the problem of interaction. On the other hand, the very nature of a mental substance, a substance defined so as to share no properties with physical substance, gives rise to additional challenges, as we saw at the end of the last section in the first philosophy chapter. Specifically, how does one utilize the categories, types, and interrelationships of this mental substance to formulate theoretical mechanisms through which one can predict, manipulate, and explain the dynamic changes that we observe in mental phenomena? And one might call this the mental mechanisms problem. And what we've seen, and what we'll continue to see, is that dualism has no research program and makes no progress on either of these problems in hundreds of years. As a result, oppositional substance dualism loses its status as a serious contender. It withers and falls by the intellectual wayside. Few researchers openly champion oppositional substance dualism in the 20th century, and of the few who seem to make some case for it, their case is only a case of skepticism as to some particular explanatory challenge facing monistic physicalism, and not in terms of a step forward or a research insight or a theoretical triumph for oppositional substance dualism. What then of monistic physicalism? Well, monistic physicalism faces two significant problems. The first problem we've been discussing since the beginning of our discussions of monistic physicalism. The second problem really starts to become crystallized with the development of biology and a treatment of the living, non-living distinction. The first problem is that theorists face what one might call this problem of physical categorization and mechanisms. Specifically, theorists must generate categories for mental phenomenon that plausibly capture the mental phenomenon, and which can also provide the basis for robust, predictive, manipulative, and explanatory theoretic models. Some philosophers call one version of this problem the problem of qualia. The problem of qualia seems to arise because the central or criterial property of some mental states seems to involve qualitative experiences. Pain, for instance, seems essentially to involve painfulness, unpleasantness, awfulness. Pleasant feelings seem not to count as pains, even if those states have the same typical causes and typical effects of painful mental states in humans. The problem of physical categorization and mechanism, as a result, seems to require two things. It seems to require both that the physicalist categorize pains using physicalistic categories so that these physicalistic categories plausibly capture all and only painful states, and two, that those physicalistic categories somehow give rise to theoretic models that can explain the qualitative nature of those pains. Second, monistic physicalists must solve the problem of demarcation. In other words, one's prima facie intuitive categorization judgments seem to indicate that the mental operates in a manner that precludes the inclusion of most physical objects and properties within the domain of the mental. To wit, every physical object has mass, but not every physical object has even, potentially, a mind. How can physicalistic categorizations and theories accommodate those intuitive categorization judgments? Or should the monistic physicalist debunk the seeming binary differences between the mental and other physical objects, properties, and processes? This is what is sometimes called the mental-non-mental distinction or mental-non-mental problem. I call it the problem of demarcation.